Hello, Reginald. Welcome to another episode of The Hard Sell, the show where the stick in the swill-bucket rattles back. Today it's another Not Brand X. And the brand we're going to look at today is one you probably don't think over much about. First Direct Bank, and specifically, how it was launched.
Thanks, I'll pick it up later. I like things a bit offbeat, me. So I bank with First Direct. Afternoon. They do things differently. Terrifies the local cats, that one.
If you're British, you've probably at least heard of First Direct in passing, or seen their adverts. Generally in black and white, often what the advertisers would describe as offbeat, off the wall, or just plain weird. The black and white was a relatively later development, but the weird has been there from the start. These days that translates into hilarious wackiness with talking CGI platypi, but back at the start it was all a bit more troubling than that. First Direct was quite a novelty when it launched in late 1989. A bank with no branches that you dealt with exclusively over the phone. Fancy. Such a futuristic concept required a futuristic launch ad. Or at least that's how the young thrusting ad agency, hhcl, that's Howell, Henry, Caldecott-Lurie and Partners, saw it. But then they saw a lot of things differently. Founded in 1987, one of their first big successes was for Molson Canadian Lager. To promote this new imported beer, they hired a little-known character actor with a funny name, Jim Dunk, and yes, he really is called that, to explicitly command viewers not to buy the stuff.
Now some people have asked me the difference between Molson Canadian Lager and an ordinary lager. Well, your ordinary lager is much better because it comes from a brewery just up the road, whereas Molson comes from Canada. Secondly, Molson is expensive.
Strong, smooth Molson is only imported in small quantities. So once you've tasted it, you won't want to tell anyone about it.
Molson Canadian Lager. It tastes terrible.
An unusual premise in itself, but hhcl followed it right down the conceptual rabbit hole.
Nah.
Heedless of where it might eventually take them.
What have you been doing today then?
Shooting some lager commercials.
Any good?
No.
Not for the last time, hhcl had doggedly followed a stylistic premise until they'd finally arrived at full-blown Dadaist anti-advertising. And it was hhcl who were hired by the Midland Bank, one of the four dominant banks in the UK at the time, to launch their new phone banking subsidiary. And as I said, something as then unusual as First Direct couldn't be advertised like a normal bank. They had to do something out of the ordinary, or at least they figured they did. So in the end they did several. Starting by insisting on the logistical nightmare of having the advert broadcast on both commercial channels at once. Now this would be enough of a headache now, even if they did limit themselves to just the same two channels. But these were the days before Channel 4 bought and sold its own advertising on a nationwide basis. Instead, First Direct and hhcl would have had to deal with each one of the ITV regions in turn and separately from their discussions over the ITV slot. Unsurprisingly, but unusually for the time, the advert was only ever shown once, a gambit invented by and for Apple's 1984 advert.
For the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology.
That ran during the Super Bowl, when tens of millions of pairs of eyes were glued to the screen. This version, despite running on 2 channels at once, wouldn't have anything like that kind of captive viewership, so the concept had to be even more startling than Apple's Ridley Scott-directed vision of a dystopian future ruled by David Graham.
Our eyes shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
And it is. Here, after all that frigging build-up, it is. Do not adjust your set.
As well as being tested in the Arctic and the Sahara, the new Audi Coupe has been tested on the world's toughest streets.
Please do not be alarmed. This is the first attempt to communicate across time. This experiment is being sponsored by First Direct to celebrate our 21st anniversary. For us, it is the year 2010. First Direct, we have returned to the date of our launch. We return you now to your programs with best wishes for your personal happiness in your own future.
To answer your first question, yes, people really were taken in. Well, I shouldn't think anyone seriously thought they'd just seen a transmission from the future, but there were several people confused enough to ring up the IBA and ask if all that was meant to happen. And that reaction wouldn't have been possible without some near-psychotic attention to detail on the part of both hhcl and the production company they actually hired to make it, Altman's Young. The opening gambit, for instance, looks and sounds exactly like a real Audi advert in every way. I mean, for all I know, they actually got permission to genuinely use a real Audi advert, but that doesn't seem likely. Certainly not without a lot of outlay added to an already expensive ad. And extensive searching has found no evidence of this being the start of an actual Audi advert from the time. But if Altman's Young did custom build it themselves, they deserve acclaim just for making it seem so authentic. Down to the camera work, the editing, the cinematography, the soundtrack, and of course, Jeffrey Palmer, the voice of Audi. Even the bloody film stock looks accurate, and it had to, because one tiny jarring detail and the whole effect would have been ruined. The higher a concept is, the further it has to fall. One slip, one chink in the armour of absolute realism, and this whole thing would have just looked silly. In a bad way. And made First Direct look silly, and right at the start of its existence as well. The key is sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. Having said that, I now fully expect to find out that this actually was a real Audi advert that ran quite a lot in October of 1989, and not a fake custom built by Altman's Young for the purposes of interrupting it. But if this isn't the real thing, then it's indistinguishable from it in every way. And that adds weight to the real meat of the advert, the glimpse of the utopian future of 2010. Which, ironically, is almost nothing like the real thing, but they weren't to know that. And maybe it accidentally crossed brains as well as timelines, and actually comes from a reality where the credit crunch and Great Recession never happened. Tony Benn became Prime Minister in 1992, Osama bin Laden died of kidney failure in 1997, and England just won the World Cup. Oh, Midland Bank was never bought out by HSBC, apparently. Fortunately, that detail aside, First Direct did survive to 2010 and beyond, so the advert doesn't look overly triumphalist in hindsight.
Celebrate the 21st anniversary of First Direct. We have to turn to the date of our launch. We return you now to your programs with best wishes for your personal happiness in your own future.
So that was a bold start. That definitely got First Direct noticed, despite only being shown once. Or twice, but simultaneously. The overt futurism served to underline the idea that they were trying to transmit, that this was an innovative and entirely new venture, unlike anything we've seen before. But there's more than one way to skin an artichoke, and because that one was only going out once, unannounced, in a deliberate effort to bewilder the viewers, a second launch ad arrived hot on its heels, one much more indicative of the tone and style hhcl would soon be adopting. This one repeated the gimmick and logistical headache of being shown on ITV and Channel 4 simultaneously, and because of that it didn't go out very often either. But to a completely different effect. While the original time-travelling advert went out on 2 stations at once to make it seem like the TV was being hijacked, this one made actual creative use of the notion. Allow Charlotte Rampling to explain.
First Direct is a new banking organisation that does things differently. For a start, no branches. What's your reaction? For a pessimistic view, stay on this channel. For an optimistic view, turn to ITV now.
You may have noticed something missing from the first one. Any kind of elaboration as to what the fuck it was advertising beyond the name. And, unless you blinked and missed it, the fact that it was a subsidiary of Midland Bank. Explaining what First Direct is and what's so special about it is this advert's job. Or maybe these adverts. Because they did it by giving you the illusion of choice as to whether or not to buy into it. Viewers on Channel 4 could watch Steve Punt expressing extreme scepticism about the whole notion of a bank with no branches.
You heard my First Direct. Won't work, I'm sure. They say they're a new kind of banking. Ha, no branches no more. But we've had branches for years. What they changing it for? They say you can call their people 24 hours a day. They're far too new and different. They'll close down right away, like tomorrow, honey. They're not an old institution. That's where my money stays.
On ITV, some other Burke, with a cheerful song about how great it is.
I'm gonna have a place for my money. I can call both night and day. I'm gonna speak to intelligent people there who will do anything I say. They can give me instant decisions. I get an overdraft automatically. First Direct will be wonderful, yeah, for you and me. They don't have any branches. They can spend more on the service, you see. First Direct will be wonderful, yeah, for you and me.
Because First Direct don't have branches, they can spend more on service.
And it's free.
Did you spot the crossover? Sadly I checked and it doesn't correspond to a moment in the other one where we would see the exact same scene from the other side. That surely would have been the next stage of this gimmick, the ability to flip channels and see the same scene play out from different angles. So those were the launch ads. Very expensive, very high concept, and very logistically complex. So much so, it was almost impossible to show them more than once. So they didn't. Fortunately, they didn't need to be. This was a relatively new kind of advert to these shores, the super powerful blockbuster that doesn't actually say a whole lot, instead acting as a massive exclamation mark after the company's name. hhcl had got First Direct into people's heads. Now they had to keep them there. And for preference, stir in some useful information. They chose to do this by going in completely the opposite direction to the noisy high-concept first ads. Well, not completely the opposite direction. They retained Charlotte Rampling and the basic goal of baffling the audience into opening an account out of sheer confusion. In fact, that sentence was pretty much the entire brief. Take a look.
If you bank with First Direct, you could ask someone to pay all your bills with one phone call, right now.
Here's another one.
Doesn't matter what time it is. Doesn't matter what day it is. You can ring our new person-to-person banking service now.
What do the images have to do with anything? Well, this should explain it.
Phone your bank now. If nobody answers, ring First Direct instead.
Welcome to the sellout theatre of the absurd. Instead of wanting to shock its audience out of bourgeois complacency, we just want to confuse them into remembering the name of a bank.
First Direct is a new person-to-person banking service that's open now. So move your overdraft.
If you're worried that you might be missing something, don't. You're not. There's nothing to miss. It's pure absurdism. You don't understand because no understanding is possible. The images don't relate. The adverts don't make sense. That's the point.
How long have you been with your current bank? How does it feel?
You might be irritated by them, and a lot of people were, especially by the one with the buckets. But you don't forget them.
Ring your Auntie Doris. You won't get a 24-hour banking service. Ring us, and you will.
It helped that the formula was so beautifully simple. A truly random still image, a gnomic statement from Charlotte Rampling, and a logo and a phone number.
The high street banks don't like the interest rates we pay out. Oh.
Eventually, even this formula became subject to ironic self-aware deconstruction.
Super logo. Super phone number. Super.
Of course, once you're doing things like that, you're really going to try the audience's patience. So a third wave of these ads let Rampling go home to France and switch to live action footage, mostly directed by Peter Richardson, of all people, clearly building up funds for the BBC incarnation the comic strip presents. Well, it's the thought that counts. Needless to say, the adverts remained as elliptical as ever.
I've never actually seen the people at First Direct, but I believe they exist.
Not to mention as self-commenting.
I joined First Direct because of the interest rates.
Not the ads?
No, I hate the ads.
No, really.
I hated that ad with the 2 blue buckets about radical new banking.
I like the one we did.
Sadly, hhcl and First Direct parted company around the time Midland Bank, First Direct's parent, was taken over by HSBC. Not that I know if there's a connection there. hhcl had also just got the Britvic account, which would make them super famous in advertising circles. Their successors with First Direct were the ones who introduced the enduring black and white aesthetic, but sadly they swapped the wildly baffling Dadaist musings for standard issue advertising wackiness.
Would you mind stepping out of the car, please, sir?
You weren't speeding, were you? Were you speeding?
No, I wasn't. I've been busting to show someone this. This is my First Direct checkbook, and this is my check card. 500 quid a day on this. If I had 500 quid. I can ring him anytime, 24 hours a day. I can ring him now if I want. Watch this. I'll ask for my balance.
Meet a First Direct customer and you'll know all about it.
I've never known banking so easy.
I say sadly, if you ask most people, they'd say they preferred it that way, and quite understandably. And you certainly wouldn't want all adverts to consist of baffling the abstract non sequiturs and the like. In fact, the whole point of absurdism is to stand out among the ordinary. But speaking as a Ponce with an art degree, obsessive-compulsive disorder and an Andy Kaufman streak, I like it when adverts, and other more worthwhile forms of art for that matter, go out of their way to confuse and unsettle and even make their audience for nor question their own reality. When it's done for reasons other than to get people to open a bank account, so much the better, but there is something appealingly subversive about doing it for advertising.
Black and white, some of them, but they're good. And those Australian ads, they're really funny. What? Funny. And the moody ones. Well, you can't even see what the guy's drinking, but they're great, you see. Oh, no. There's a lot of very good lager advertising out there.